Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this brief audio presentation, we're going to talk about the role of planning in the context of entrepreneurial management. We'll talk about why entrepreneurs should plan, discuss a few types of plans, some of the questions that you should be asking in the planning process, and address the question of whether or not you really need a business plan. The first question you might be asking is, why are we planning in the first place? Didn't we spend time talking about the importance of the lean startup framework in which we don't plan everything out, in which we perform small experiments and iterate to find the right product market fit? Isn't build, measure, learn all about not planning and building first instead? And the answer is yes, all of that is important. And it's a useful and critical mindset for entrepreneurs to utilize to ensure that they don't get trapped into a cycle of trying to wait indefinitely for exactly the right moment to launch. But that doesn't mean you don't do any planning at all, and it doesn't mean that you can afford to simply ignore potential outcomes. Planning serves more purposes than just trying to find the perfect path forward. First, it helps ensure alignment on long-term goals. Planning is a great way to make sure that everyone on the team is trying to get the same thing done. It makes your intentions and outcomes explicit and helps you prepare for future choices. So a great example of this was a good friend of mine started an education nonprofit in Washington, D.C. called the Seed Foundation, opening boarding schools for inner city kids who were unlikely to succeed in the public school system. And at one point, the foundation was running out of financial resources and was approached by a third-party organization that wanted the foundation to provide consulting to school districts in order to help them utilize some of the tools that the Seed Foundation had developed to be successful with underperforming inner-city kids. And it was a very attractive proposition. It would generate cash. It would help propagate some of the ideals of the foundation on a larger scale. But fundamentally, it wasn't in the foundation's plan. And so when the founder and I chatted about it, I had to point out, you have to do one of two things here. Either you have to change the plan to account for this, that this is part of the mission of the foundation, or you have to turn it down. And in the end, they turned it down. And it was a very tough decision, but it was the right choice for them, I think, because it helped ensure that they were staying focused on what the real mission of the organization was. Planning also helps you organize near versus long-term actions. It helps you prioritize. Is this something that needs to be done now, or is this part of the longer-term objective of the organization? So there are lots of different types of planning documents that you can create, and your textbook provides a really useful guide to all sorts of types of plan, some of which are based on the stage of the venture, the level of the detail, or just even how long the document actually is. And I see all of these as really variations of opportunity descriptions, right? All of these are sort of explaining where the opportunity is and how the organization's actually going to exploit them. They're not even really all planning documents. I mean, even a business model is described as a type of planning document, and that's not really a planning document. It's a snapshot of sort of what the opportunity looks like in the context of how you design the organization. So the challenge here is there's no definitive requirement for plan generation. Most ventures, ones that I've worked with, ones that I've studied, ones that I've mentored, they tend to create plans as demanded by stakeholders, right? So, and that could be, the stakeholder could be the founder who has done plans in the past and wants one now. It could be a CEO who's been hired in from the outside, or it could be the board. It could be investors, a grant agency. It could be strategic partners. It even could be customers. The point being that although the textbook suggests that you might go through a linear process of going from simpler to more complex plans, realistically it's a little hard to predict in advance what you're going to need at any given time. And so my hope here is that you'll recognize the terminology and the characteristics of the different types of plans, and you'll be sophisticated enough to use them as needed. So some of the examples of plans that the textbook describes are the business model canvas, which we've talked about, a business brief, which you might think of as sort of an executive summary, a feasibility study, which is sort of an effort to demonstrate whether or not the underlying business model is viable, pitch deck, which is one of the most common forms of venture documentation now, and then the classic sort of business plan. There are many other types of plans. A video pitch, which is very common for crowdfunding activities and also for presenting to venture capital funds. A private placement memorandum, which is usually limited to use in investment situations. Or even a Gantt chart, which is a way of showing the various activities of the organization as they depend upon each other. There's a variety of questions that you might want to ask in your planning process, and many of these actually are very closely related to some of the questions we've been asking throughout the course, associated with the opportunity and the market, the goals of the entrepreneur, and so on. And what the textbook provides, and I've tried to sort of update a little bit here, is identifying which questions are relevant and the tool that you might use in order to try to assess each of those. And so, for example, obviously, if you're going to be trying to figure out how big the market is as part of your planning process, bottom-up calculation is going to be your best bet if you can do it. A competitor map is described in the textbooks, a very useful way for thinking about competition. There are many other tools. I'm very partial to a table in a business planning document or a pitch deck that shows the various characteristics of the solution that the various competitors offer in comparison to the solution that the venture offers. So as you're going through this process of thinking about what the organization needs to do and how it's going to do it, these kinds of questions and these kinds of tools are all mechanisms that you can use to make sure that you're accomplishing the planning as needed in the situation. One of the most common questions that I get asked is whether a business plan, a formal business plan, is needed. And my answer to that is actually quite different now than it was 25 years ago when I really began getting involved in startup companies and venturing and entrepreneurship in general. In the 90s and even the early 2000s, business plans were really still standard. It was just something that you generated. And we do, I think, many schools of business teach business plan writing. I do not teach it in my classes anymore for two reasons. One is it's really fallen out of favor in practice. There are some very specific situations where you need it, but not nearly as many as in the past. And two, it's actually quite a challenging document to grade in a class because a business plan fundamentally predicts the future. And, you know, the idea that I can grade how well a team predicts the future strikes me as a little bit pretentious. I mean, I think I'm, having read thousands of business plans and having run a couple companies and funded others, I'm pretty good at spotting problems in business plans, but exactly what makes a business plan useful is a little different. So I don't generally teach business plan writing anymore. My perspective now is that the default answer is no. You don't need a business plan just because you think you're launching a venture or you have launched a venture. You need a business plan when an investor, partner, or funder requests it. If you're trying to sell stock to someone and they say, I want to see a business plan, then you better have an answer. A business plan is really useful if you want to clarify assumptions about what it is you think you're doing. There's something about writing things down that helps make sure that you really are explaining them in a way that makes sense. If you need to align your team expectations and goal setting, a business plan is a really powerful way to do it. Bring your team together, explain the process of writing a business plan, and write it collaboratively. And you'll see people have different perspectives on things. The document at the end, if everybody signs off on it, means you're in alignment. If you want to put a stake in the ground to support future decision making and or monitoring your progress, just like the example I provided with the Seed Foundation, once the plan was there, they could look at new opportunities and say, is that in the plan? If it's not in the plan, then we only have two options. We either change the plan or we turn the new opportunity down. One of the other dangers of a business plan is that it's generally obsolete right after you write it. And I've seen in the past and have said in the past that a business plan is a living document. I think that I've come to the conclusion that that's actually just not true. Business plans tend to get written and then they tend to get shelved. And so I want to be cautious about how we approach business plan writing. There are situations where it's absolutely essential, but it's been said many times that Your plan doesn't survive first contact with the enemy. I don't know which US general said that. My own experience is that of the thousands of business plans I've written, the companies I've started, the entrepreneurs I've mentored, the companies we've funded, I've never seen a business plan executed exactly as it's written the first time through. It just doesn't happen. This process of predicting the future is fundamentally imperfect. So some general tips on planning for you. Make sure you match the plan to the needs of the stakeholders. If you're asked for a business plan, check to see whether a pitch deck really would make more sense, or a feasibility study. Data is everything, in my opinion, right? And I know that data has, in some ways, we've seen a divergence in how people use data. Some people really focus on getting the data and making decisions out of it, and some people have abandoned data altogether. I'm reminded of the statement from Kellyanne Conway about alternative facts. Well, entrepreneurs usually don't have that kind of luxury to be able to say we're going to use, facts that aren't actually real. So in your business planning documentation, I encourage you to stick to the real facts. Remove any fluff or jargon or hyperbole. If it's in there and you can't justify it, it probably shouldn't be in there. On the other hand, while it's important to be realistic, you can note the upside, right? There's nothing wrong with saying, we think that the market is this big, but under these circumstances, it could potentially be this big, right? If the data shows that that's the case, you have every right to explain it. Recognize the weaknesses in the team and the plan and the various options ahead of you. Don't pretend that those weaknesses don't exist. Investors, partners are savvy, smart people, and they're going to look at plans and say, this looks like a weakness, right? You don't have someone who knows how to do marketing work. Pretending that's not the case doesn't help your cause. Acknowledging it and then seeking out support and resources does help your cause. Share your plans early and often with trusted advisors to find gaps, especially in things like distribution. A lot of entrepreneurs get started, they don't really know the sales and marketing side of things. Trusted advisors will help you spot the flaws and gaps in your plan, which your investors are going to point out anyway. So don't you want to hear it from a friendly critic first, so you know what's coming? Absolutely use visuals, charts, graphs, images where appropriate and value added, but don't just use cool graphics for fun. It seems like a good idea at the beginning, especially for first-time entrepreneurs who have perhaps a little more marketing background. We've been trained to do things like to make things more memorable with clever graphics, but investors they ignore all of that, and partners are pretty smart as well about those kinds of things. Couple of other thoughts. Try to avoid looking foolish or naive. There's all sorts of things you can say in your business plan that can cause you problems. Maybe the most common one is there is no competition. I have never, in thousands of business plans, ever seen that stated accurately. Everything has competition in one form or another. Don't assume that people will work for you for free. A lot of entrepreneurs start out their planning process assuming that they'll work for free and their partners will work for free and their employees will work for free, and that turns up in the pro formas, and it always looks bad. Don't show the wrong market size for your product. We looked at a startup company many years ago that had a really smooth software tool for designing the sprinkler systems for large commercial construction projects, but they said their market was the global construction market, which is like $3 trillion a year. That's not their market, right? They're not building buildings. And so don't make those kinds of mistakes just because you're trying to show how big the market is. Again, savvy investors and partners are smarter than that. Don't ever claim your financials are conservative. Why would you do that? Why would you show conservative numbers? Show the numbers that are real. And nobody believes that statement anyway. Present your financials appropriately, only what you can reasonably defend. If your financials are indefensible, then then provide something else. Just show a budget. If you're going to need to provide pro forma financials, which many potential investors and partners may want to see, make sure you document all of the assumptions that are associated with them and where and how you're making those assumptions. And ladies and gentlemen, proofread. I get it, right? Your ability to use proper grammar and spell may not seem like the most relevant to whether or not your business is viable, but if I'm going to give you money to run a business, I want to know you're going to take it seriously, right? If you've got all sorts of spelling errors and grammatical problems, what does that say about your communication with customers or your communications with me or any other investors? Ladies and gentlemen, proofread. This stuff does make a difference. So I hope this gives you some thoughts on planning. Your textbook obviously provides a lot more detail. And as we close this out, it's important to recognize that entrepreneurship is more than simply one set of rules around what you need to do. And I hope that this section on planning kind of balances the need to experiment. Entrepreneurship's a bit of a tight wire act, right? So you have to, on the one hand, know where you're going, and on the other, you have to be prepared to adapt on a moment's notice. That's one of the great challenges of being entrepreneurial.